Have you ever felt that not only your English, but your own voice seemed to disappear after a betrayal? I thought I would never be able to trust or connect sincerely again, until a journey to Denmark, a land of slow-spoken words and understandable silences, taught me how to rebuild everything from scratch. This is not just my story, but it could also be the solution to your impasse. The invitation. Imagine you've just been through an earthquake of trust. Everything you once thought was certain suddenly shattered. And in that chaos, you can no longer hear your own voice. I was there. I was stuck in a loop of doubt and silence. Then one day my inbox chimed. It was a message from an old friend in Denmark, someone I hadn't seen in years. The words were simple. It's cold here, but the sky is incredibly clear. Why not come for a visit? It wasn't a social courtesy. It was a lifeline. This was no longer a vacation. It was an escape. I realized that to find my voice again, sometimes you have to place yourself somewhere so unfamiliar that you're forced to start from the most basic sounds. And Denmark, with a tranquility I had never known, became the perfect laboratory for this anxious rebirth. I booked the ticket, little knowing that this journey would teach me more about communication, about trust, than any textbook ever could. First morning in Copenhagen. Your brain has a strange mechanism. When hurt, it turns every unfamiliar space into a mirror reflecting the inner loneliness. I woke up in a small apartment in Vesterbro, Copenhagen. The Nordic autumn light, clear and cold, poured through the window. Everything was frighteningly quiet. No car horns, no loud chatter, just the wind rustling through the golden leaves. That silence wasn't the peaceful silence I had imagined. It felt like a judgment. And in that stillness, the old thoughts flooded back. What am I doing here? I don't belong in this place. I tried speaking a few simple English sentences aloud to hear my own voice, but it sounded artificial and weak, as if it too had been betrayed. I turned on the TV, trying to mimic the Danish news anchors, but their smooth syllables only made me feel more clumsy. This wasn't just a language barrier. It was an emotional wall. I realized that before I could practice listening to English, I had to learn to listen to the silence within myself and accept that every beginning is fragile. That first breakfast, alone with a piece of rugbrod and a bitter coffee, was the first lesson in patience. The language of silence. You know, there's a paradox about language learning. We often focus too much on speaking and forget that silence is also a part of communication. In Denmark, I learned this the hard way. Danes are very comfortable with pauses in conversation. But for someone carrying the cracks of betrayal like me, every silence felt like torture. I began conversations with my friend from a defensive stance, always trying to fill every gap with clumsy English, with redundant words, just because I was afraid the silence would reveal my insecurity. And then one afternoon, as we sat in a park, a long silence stretched out. Instead of hastily filling it, I took a deep breath and let it be. And something miraculous happened. In that silence, I realized I was truly listening, hearing the birds, the wind, and even my own breath. I suddenly understood that listening practice isn't about trying to catch every single word, but about creating a safe space in your mind for those sounds to permeate. When you stop trying to react and start receiving, everything becomes easier. That was the key: acceptance. Accepting that you don't need to speak all the time. Accepting that sometimes silence doesn't mean judgment. And accepting that the cracks in trust also need such silences to begin healing. This lesson about silence, it turned out, was the foundation for all genuine conversation. A conversation with a stranger. Let me paint you a picture of the psychological battlefield my mind had become. After the betrayal, my brain had essentially become a fortress on high alert. The drawbridge was permanently up, the moat filled with doubts, and I was terrified to let anyone new cross, especially using a language I didn't feel I owned. Every potential conversation felt like a risk, a chance to be misunderstood or, worse, judged. This anxiety was my constant companion when I stepped into a tiny, dimly lit cafe in Norebro. The air was rich with the scent of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked pastries, a sensory experience that should have been comforting, but for me, was just the backdrop for another internal struggle. My mission seemed simple, almost trivial: order a coffee and a pastry. Yet my heart was hammering against my ribs, as if I were about to deliver a speech to 1,000 people, not just one barista. I had rehearsed the sentence in my head. A black coffee and that cinnamon roll, please. It was a simple script. But then the barista, a woman with genuinely kind eyes and a soft, patient smile, looked at me and asked a question. It was likely something simple like, for here or to go? Or would you like anything else? But in my state of high alert anxiety, the sounds blurred together into an incomprehensible stream. My mind didn't just go blank, it froze solid. The old familiar fears came rushing back. The fear of sounding stupid, of being an inconvenience, of confirming my own insecurities about not belonging. The easiest thing would have been to retreat, to just point at the pastry in the glass case and nod, to shrink back into the safety of nonverbal communication. I felt the impulse to do just that. But then I remembered the silence in the park. I remembered the power of just being in a moment without fighting it. I took a slow, deliberate breath, and instead of pointing, I looked at her and said the most liberating, transformative phrase I have ever learned in English. "I'm so sorry, could you please say that again? I'm still learning." What happened next wasn't just a transaction. It was a therapy session in human connection. She didn't sigh. She didn't roll her eyes or look past me to the next customer. Her smile widened and she said, "Of course," then repeated her question slowly and clearly. When I stumbled over the Danish word for cinnamon roll, kanelsnigel, she gently helped me with the pronunciation, turning my failed attempt into a shared, light-hearted moment. That entire interaction lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it caused a seismic shift in my perspective. The goal of speaking, I realized in that cafe, wasn't perfection. It wasn't about constructing flawless, grammatically impeccable sentences. The true goal was connection. My English was broken, fragmented, and hesitant, yes. But in that moment with that one patient person, it was also perfectly, utterly enough. It was the first tangible proof that communication isn't about building immaculate linguistic structures. It's about building bridges between people. And I learned that a bridge built with imperfect, honest, and courageous words is infinitely stronger and more durable than any perfectly constructed, yet isolating wall of silence. The bicycle philosophy. Copenhagen is a city that moves on two wheels. Everywhere you look, there's a river of people on bicycles, grandparents, students in suits, parents with toddlers and little front loaders. They glide through the city with an effortless balance that seems almost magical. One afternoon, my friend lent me her old bicycle. The moment I got on, the wobbling began. My body was tense, my grip on the handlebars was white-knuckled, and every small bump threatened to send me tumbling. I was overcorrecting, overthinking every tiny movement. And then it hit me. This was exactly how I approached speaking English. I was so terrified of making a mistake, of wobbling, that I would either freeze completely or pedal in frantic, jerky bursts of speech that left everyone breathless. But watching the Danes, I saw the secret. They weren't staring at their front wheels, hyper-focused on not falling. They were looking ahead at where they wanted to go. Their balance came from momentum, from forward motion. So I lifted my gaze from the cobblestones right in front of my tire and looked down the street. I relaxed my shoulders. I started to pedal with a steadier rhythm. The wobbling didn't completely stop, but it lessened. I was moving, and that was what mattered. This is the core of the bicycle philosophy for language learning. You will wobble. You will make grammatical mistakes, use the wrong word, and your pronunciation will be off. But if you fixate on the wobble, you will fall. The key is to maintain your momentum, to keep speaking, keep listening, keep putting one linguistic pedal in front of the other. Your balance and fluency will come not from avoiding errors, but from the forward motion of consistent practice. It's not about a perfect ride. It's about staying on the bike and enjoying the journey toward your destination. The Hygge moment. There's a Danish concept called Hygge, pronounced Hygge, that has no direct English translation. It's that feeling of cozy contentment, of warmth and connection, often created with soft lighting, warm drinks, and good company. It's not about grand gestures. It's about the quality of the moment. One rainy evening, my friend invited a few of her friends over. I felt a familiar spike of anxiety. New people meant new conversations, more opportunities to feel awkward. The setting was pure Hygge. Candles flickering on the table, the smell of glögg, mulled wine, filling the small apartment, and thick wool blankets on the sofa. The conversation started, and initially I retreated into my shell, just listening. But then something changed. One of them turned to me and asked, not about my job or my qualifications, but, "What has been your favorite moment in Copenhagen so far?" It was a simple, personal question. There was no pressure for a complex answer. I took a breath and described the feeling of cycling over the bridge at sunset, using simple words, pausing when I needed to find the right one. No one interrupted. They just listened, their faces warm and interested. Then they shared their own simple favorite moments. In that Hygge atmosphere, the English language shed its formal, intimidating skin. It became a tool not for performance but for sharing. My mistakes didn't matter. My intention did. The focus shifted from how I was saying something to what I was sharing. That evening taught me that we don't need perfect English to build real connections. What we need is a Hygge space, a psychologically safe environment where the goal is mutual understanding and warmth, not linguistic perfection. It's in these spaces that our confidence to speak truly begins to grow. Rebuilding my voice. As I cycled along the canal on a crisp weekend morning, the pale Nordic sun casting long, weak rays across the water's surface, a profound realization settled over me, as gentle and inevitable as the dawn. The parallel processes of rebuilding my ability to speak English with confidence and healing my shattered capacity for trust were not just similar. They were fundamentally the same journey. Both required a foundation not of strength but of surrender, the surrender to acceptance. I had to first accept the broken state of things, the grammatical errors that littered my speech and the cracks in my heart from betrayal. I had to accept that the path to wholeness would be long, non-linear, and demand a kind of patience I didn't know I possessed, especially towards myself. For so long, my approach to both had been rooted in self-punishment. Every mispronounced word was a personal failure. Every awkward pause in conversation was proof of my inadequacy. I treated my linguistic stumbles with the same harshness I treated my own judgment for having trusted someone who proved untrustworthy. I was building a prison of perfectionism where any flaw was a catastrophe. But Denmark, with its quiet canals and its philosophy of forward motion, taught me a different way. The bricks for reconstruction were not flawless, identical slabs of perfection. They were rough, uneven, and authentic moments of trying. Each time I dared to raise my hand in a shop and say, "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" I'm still learning. I was laying a brick. Each time I attempted to order a Kanelsnigel and butchered the pronunciation, only to be met with a patient smile, I was mixing the mortar of human connection. Every small story I shared about my home country, using simple and perfect sentences, was another brick firmly set in place. The psychology behind this is powerful. When we reframe our mistakes not as failures but as data points, as evidence of effort and growth, we rewire our brain's fear response. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, calms down. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for learning and rational thought, takes over. I stopped seeing a conversation as a test I could fail and started seeing it as an experiment in connection. The goal was no longer to be perfect, the goal was to be understood. And just like trust, which is rebuilt not through grand declarations but through 1,000 small, consistent acts of reliability, fluency is built through 1,000 small, consistent acts of communication. It's in the hello to the barista, the thank you to the bus driver, the what does this mean? Asked to a friend. My voice, both in its literal acoustic form and in its metaphorical sense as my agency and self-expression, began to change. The tremor of anxiety that used to tighten my vocal cords began to loosen. It found a new rhythm, one that wasn't rushed or frantic, but slow, steady, and resilient. It was a voice learning to trust itself again. Not because it was perfect, but because it was persevering. The unspoken understanding. My last evening in Copenhagen arrived. My friend and I sat on a bench by the lakes, watching the swans glide silently in the twilight. We had shared so many conversations during my stay, clumsy ones, funny ones, deep ones. But in this final moment, we sat in a comfortable, extended silence. It wasn't the intimidating silence of my first days. It was a peaceful, shared quiet. I looked at the city skyline, at the gentle lights beginning to twinkle, and I felt a profound sense of clarity. The answer to the question I had carried with me. Can trust, once broken, ever be rebuilt stronger? Wasn't a loud, dramatic yes. It was a quiet understanding that settled in my bones. Trust, like language, isn't about a perfect, unbroken record. It's about the willingness to re-engage after a rupture. It's about the choice to sit in silence with someone and feel safe. It's about the courage to say a simple, imperfect sentence and trust that the person listening will strive to understand your intention. My journey to rebuild my English voice had become a metaphor for rebuilding my capacity to trust the world. The cracks were still there, in both my grammar and my heart, but they were no longer empty voids. They had been filled with the gold of new experiences, of patient teachers in cafes, of Hygge moments with friends, and of the simple, relentless act of getting back on the bicycle day after day. The trust wasn't blind anymore. It was resilient. It was a trust that knew falling was possible but believed in the strength to get up again. And my English? It was no longer a barrier but a bridge that was strong not because it was perfect, but because it had been tested and it had held.